I did this so long ago, I don't remember what's in it. This is a benefit of advanced age. It's very difficult for economists to deal with the problems that we're looking at in today's world. I always think back to how I started as an economist. I was a graduate student, I needed money. I got a grant studying a research project on water because the US was running out of water. Okay, this is well, I won't say how many years ago, but the project looked at the New Jersey chemical industry, pollution by the chemical industry of the water base in New Jersey. And what we did was to team up with a bunch of what we now call environmentalists, over scientists, and explain to us how river courses have the ability to self-clean. So the first thing that we had to calculate was how much could you pollute a river without polluting a river? And that became an input into what? Well, it became an input into a production function. And I ended up spending a summer calculating a production function with this externality of the rivers with one of these old manual machines in which you then used to have to calculate production functions. Obviously, when I showed up in Cambridge and people told me that production functions were a bad thing, I said, yeah, I know all about that. That's the way it worked. Okay, so we're looking at a problem that everybody has known about for, not for since it became a problem, but even before that, in terms of relevant things. And one of the difficulties that is in these sorts of is trying to find the appropriate framework. Okay, the appropriate framework then was, well, there's this externality that exists, and if we can just manage to keep the pollution of the chemical industries down to the level in which the rivers don't get polluted, everything will be fine. Okay, well, no, everything is not going to be fine because of the way we deal with that problem. That was an externality. Markets don't deal with those externalities, and you either go in and you regulate the chemical industry. You regulate the chemical industry, the state of New Jersey collapses, and, well, it just doesn't really work well that way. And this is what it seems to me that we're trying to do again. We're going to go through this climate transition. Okay, climate transition, what does this mean? Well, climate transition means that, if we manage to get the temperature down to that, magic number, somehow or other things are going to be okay. Well, they're not going to be okay. And they're not going to be okay because, as we know from all of our nice production functions and DSG models and everything else, linearities are linearities and nonlinear systems are nonlinear systems. And nonlinear systems, you don't go back, honey. There's no going back to where you were before. So even if you do manage to get that temperature down to where it is, you're going to have problems that are not going to be solvable simply by looking at this idea of dealing with climate or climate change. Now, if you look at that in the context as an economist, I always think back to this idea of trade. Okay, we had trade theory. Adam Smith talked about trade theory. Remember invisible hand? Okay, the invisible hand was what? Invisible hand was something or other managed to convince domestic investors to invest domestically. Okay, it didn't have anything to do with the market at all. Where that nonsense came from, well, we know where it came from, Chicago. But that's what it was about. It was about the question of whether or not you had factor mobility. Did capital move or didn't it move? Did labor move or didn't it move? And we all worried about that a lot. Okay? If you were China for over, 5, 6, 7,000 years, labor mobility was a problem, because you've always had these guys in the north who were coming in and taking over your country. Okay? Extra-Lean, Semper-Stolzums, and all of these guys said, oh, don't worry about labor mobility. You can keep labor where it is, you keep capital where it is, and we just trade. Trade goes across borders, right? Trade goes across borders, and that solves that problem of capital mobility. Well, from my point of view, one of the biggest problems that we now have is that while trade solved the border problem, okay, we still have borders, but the factors are now perfectly mobile. And they're not only perfectly mobile in terms of what we call capital markets, they're now perfectly mobile in terms of labor markets and in terms of labor. Why? Well, because as a result of nonlinear climate change, there are masses of the population who can no longer remain on a sustainable basis in the places where they are. They're going to move. They're going to have to move. And there are going to be substantial costs involved with this. And if you start thinking about this, we're looking at, I would argue, a problem of the maldistribution of, well, first of all, maldistribution of labor. The people are all in the wrong places. Maldistribution of food production, sustainability, droughts, water. Back to my base of water. What's the problem with water? Well, there's not enough water that's frozen anymore, but we're never going to refreeze it. There's too much water in the atmosphere. Okay, how do we solve that problem? Well, nature solves that problem. We have tornadoes and we have floods and we have all sorts, okay? These are all costs which are due to the maldistribution. And these are costs that we're going to have to meet. So on the one hand, as an economist, I say, yeah, I don't know how much it costs to finance carbon capture. I don't know how much it costs to do all of these nice technical things. But there are nice economic things that we have to take care of as a result of climate change, which are not going to go away. Now, you can see this in terms of immigration policy in virtually every country, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in the United States. These are problems that are dealt with how? Oh, well, nicely, they're dealt with on a political basis, but they have to be done on an economic basis. We have to be able to finance these things. How are we going to do that? Well, the market. No, the market is not going to do that. The market is not going to relocate 90% of the population of Honduras if Honduras ends up underwater, okay? It's going to have to be done, well, I don't know how it's going to be done, but it's a problem which has to be done, and we have to think about this. Now, the first way to do this is to think about, as I say, go back to trade, okay? Why do we have problems in trade? Why do we have problems with developing countries? And I look at this and I say, well, external constraints. External constraints are what? Well, the external constraints are back to those borders, okay? And it's the borders that create the external constraints. Why? Because we keep our balance of payments accounts in terms of national borders. And this gets me to the next point, which is as long as we deal with these problems which are generic and global, we're not going to be able to deal with them on a national basis. You can have as many COPs as you want, but I think that's what you call these very nice meetings where everybody gets together and they sell their oil. But you're not going to have COP meetings that are going to solve these sorts of problems on a negotiated basis across national governments. So we have to start looking, well, I would say we have to start looking at what? Well, John Robinson always had this thing is that history has this strange ability to go around corners, okay? Now, going around corners means what? Well, if you're a driver or anybody else, you know that you don't know what's around the corner, okay? You have absolutely no idea what the system is going to throw up as a response to this. But one of the responses is going to be in terms of the way we define borders, the way we define nation states, and the way we define these sorts of financing. Now, I step back and I look at this and say, well, I've been in the UN, and this global governance nonsense, it just does not work. Not going to happen. We have to look at something else. The question is, how do you get some sort of global regulatory system, which is not based on domestic national decision-making, which allows nations, on the other hand, to believe that they are still sovereign, but in fact, they do not have the ability in order to impose their precise domestic policies. Now, I look at this, you say, Europe has what? Subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is a good attempt. The other attempts that we have, well, the attempts are in terms of, and obviously my background, is in terms of financial systems. So I look at the financial system. I say, in the short term, is there a way that we can do this? That is, can we get some sort of global coordination or regulation and preserve domestic sovereignty or domestic ability. And I come up with basically two answers, and both of them come, you will not be surprised, by going back to the proposals that did not get adopted in the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, basically because the financial system at that time insisted that any problems that had to be resolved could be resolved in terms of private incentives, in terms of, at that stage, international finance. So if you look at the clearing mechanism, when it was proposed, had one immediate response. And the first response came from a financial journalist, Paul Einzig. And Einzig said, if we actually do this, it means that banks are no longer going to be allowed to intermediate international finance flows, and there will be no longer the need for banks to engage in foreign exchange business. And the bankers looked at this and they said, no, that's not a good idea, because that's where we make all our money. Okay? But the first response was that we could get by without private banks. Now, why do private banks function? Well, they function by telling you, I have some stuff here in my pocket, which is I'm going to give you if you don't like the pieces of paper which we're using. Okay? They have reserves. Okay? Adam Smith already said that this business of holding reserves in gold at that time is a big waste. Why should you put that gold aside as a reserve? It could be employed productively. Okay? In the current conditions, what do we have? Well, let's go here. Like I said, I'm going to skip all of this stuff because it's... Okay. What have we got here? We've got something like $2 trillion in terms of, well, yellow metal. It's sitting there. It's not doing anything. It's reserving the private financial system. We don't need it. Okay, the private financial system in the U.S. finally, and help me, Jerry, 1970, whatever it was, when we took the last bit of gold backing off of the U.S. dollar. Okay, we don't need it. Why is it sitting there? Could we use it? Okay. Now, I know how to do financial engineering. You give me $2 trillion of gold, and I can generate a whole lot of money in which we're going to be able to respond to this maldistribution, either of population or of food sourcing or all of these things which we're not going to be able to get away from. The other possibility, as I say, this is just a possibility, these poor central bankers with all this thing. Now, the second point, which I want to make, I've got 1 minute and 52 to do this, is that if we're going to use this sort of system, we have to be very careful. And we go back to Abba Lerner. Abba Lerner very clearly pointed out that if you borrow against this system in order to finance your domestic response to climate change, this is simply a problem of redistribution. As I said, this is taking money from Peter to pay Paul, one pocket to the other. As long as it's an international financial transaction, it's a cost. Now, how can we divide the world? Well, developed countries can do what? Well, they can borrow from themselves, basically. That's what development countries do. Developing countries can't borrow from themselves. They don't have the resources to do that. They have to borrow in international financial markets. And that is a real cost. So it leads to the obvious conclusion that if we're going to support the adjustment to this maldistribution, the maldistribution goes in terms of all of those central banks holding all of that gold, transferring that gold to the funds that finance the developing countries. And they borrow domestically and get their problems out of the way. I mean, if Texas has tornadoes, fine. Well, we issue a little bit of domestic debt, and it's the problem that the people in Oregon finance the people in Texas, and everything is fine. Well, it's not fine because it's Texas, but I was born in Texas, so I have permission. The second is that if we go to Keynes' clearing system, there are proposals in the clearing system developed by a number of Oxford economists, okay? Nobody heard me say that. A number of Oxford economists who developed extensions of Keynes' initial plan. Tommy Balog, Schumacher in particular, Koleski was there, Joseph Steindl was there. They had a super group of people. Schumacher came up with a plan in which you could expand Keynes' clearing union in order to provide for, number one, the elimination of a global currency. In his plan, everybody keeps their national currency. You have a global clearing system, and as we know, clearing systems do not require the gold that I had in my pocket. That was one of Keynes' points, that clearing systems don't require capital backing, so that you don't need a global currency. Okay? Everybody said, let's get rid of the dollar. Let's get rid of the dollar. The dollar, yeah. It's not the dollar. Okay? It's Goldman Sachs. Come on, think. You can do this if you institute this type of clearing proposal that Schumacher has set up. And within that, you could also do what? Well, now, if you're familiar with clearing systems, you know that they can be manipulated. The mayor of Amsterdam knew that he could manipulate the Bank of Amsterdam's clearing system in order to finance his expenses. Okay? That's fraud. It's not good. But you can do it in a legal way to set up an investment fund, which was widely debated at the time of the clearing union and then got dropped off, okay, in order to finance these costs that we're going to have in terms of adjustment to the maldistribution. Now, we come to the point everybody said, well, you can't do this, okay? Well, sorry, but there is a private system that already does it. It does everything that was in Keynes' plan. The people who set this thing up, interestingly enough, did this all on their own, okay? They figured it out on their own and set it up. It exists, it functions, it can do every transaction you want without any basic national currency, okay? It's there, okay? You can use it if you want. Go look at it. Now, that's the sort of extreme response. And the extreme response, which responds to what? As I would argue, it responds to that ability to having a globally integrated financial system in which you can undertake the financing that we need to do without giving up this sort of preference that countries tend to have for having their own national airlines. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't. Their own national currencies. Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much.